Everyone to Brownfields, how to navigate remediation and redevelopment. My name is Tracy Gordon, Municipal Outreach Coordinator and Science Program Associate here at Raritan Headwaters Association. This webinar is a part of our Watershed Tools for Local Leaders series. Watershed Tools provides practical guidance on scientific principles, government regulations, and funding sources for watershed protection. These seminars are offered to decision makers and other stakeholders from the 38 municipalities and 3 counties in the Raritan Headwaters watershed and beyond. Our goal is to provide expert level knowledge, practical information, resources, and partnerships to assist local leaders and citizens alike to make informed decisions to protect and restore water resources. Raritan Headwaters is a 501c3 nonprofit conservation organization. Since 1959, Raritan Headwaters has focused on one thing: clean, safe water for all. We engage citizens and decision makers in the protection of our watershed and beyond through science, education, land preservation, and advocacy. This map shows the Raritan Headwaters region. The South Branch of the Raritan starts its 52-mile journey from New Jersey's largest natural lake, Bud Lake. The North Branch of the Raritan begins as a trickle out of a hillside in Mendham Borough and flows 23 miles where it meets the South Branch in Branchburg. About 2/3 of the Upper Raritan lies in the Highlands region of New Jersey. The Highlands is a crucial source of drinking water for approximately half of New Jersey's residents and is safeguarded through a combination of legislative measures and dedicated organizations. The Raritan Headwaters region provides drinking water to 300,000 of its residents, plus another 1.5 million citizens downstream. I really like this map because it provides a clear picture of where in our watershed we need to protect natural resources versus restore them. We are the region's leading provider of water quality research, habitat restoration, and water protection services. We preserve and steward critical watershed lands. RHA plays a decidedly unique role as no other organization offers a similar scope of services focused primarily on the Raritan Headwaters watershed. For the past 25 plus years or so, Raritan Headwaters has been collecting high quality data as part of its award-winning stream monitoring program. Every June, our staff and fully trained citizens pull on their waders to monitor 70 sites throughout our watershed. With the data that we collect, we prepare and present our watershed report card. This is what it looks like. Here you can see that in 2023, the overall watershed grade scored a C. I don't like getting C's. I really don't. So I think that if we all work together, we can do better than this. This spring, we're going to try something new. We're hoping to provide a 2024 watershed report card to individual towns. So please stay tuned for that. Kind of excited about that. Our next Watershed Tools for Local Leaders, we will present the 2024 Watershed-wide report card to include surface and groundwater data on April 1st. Please stay tuned for that. The land is not an inheritance from our ancestors, but a loan from our children. This is a Native American proverb. Please keep this quote in mind as you listen to our speakers, Kaylin Bruno and Carrie Martin from NJIT Center for Community Systems. They will help us to understand the process of remediating and developing contaminated sites. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kaylin Bruno. Kaylin is the Director of Environmental Services at NJIT's Technical Assistance to Brownfields. Sorry, Caitlin, you didn't get a chance to send me your bio, hon, so I'm going to let you toot your own horn. Also with us today is Carrie. She is the Environmental Sustainability Planner at NJIT Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities. otherwise known as TAB, T-A-B. Remember the soda, TAB? She holds a Master of City and Regional Planning degree and a graduate certificate in Coastal Climate Risk and Resilience from Rutgers. She also received her bachelor's degree in Public Policy and Environmental Policy down at William and Mary. Carrie strives to create safe, vibrant, and resilient communities as an environmental planning professor. I look forward to learning a lot from these fabulous ladies. So thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen. I can figure out how to do that. I don't know, what am I doing here? Oh, here we go. I think we're good.
Can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim.
All right. Well, thank you, Tracy. Sorry I didn't have a chance to send you my bio. Again, my name is Kaylin Bruno. I'm a professional geologist and a New Jersey licensed site remediation professional. That's really all you need to know about me. And also the fact that I grew up in the Raritan Headwaters area. I grew up in Randolph, so this is near and dear to my heart. I've definitely spent some time splashing around in probably some tributary um, of the Raritan. So we'll jump right in. Today we're going to give you an introduction to brownfield. So if you're here, this is the first time you're ever hearing that term, don't worry, we'll cover it. We're going to go over the brownfield redevelopment process. We're going to focus on redeveloping brownfields for water quality and resilience. Because I think that's definitely a topic near and dear to your hearts, I would hope so. And then we're going to talk to you about who we are, NJIT Tab, and how we can help assist you in this process. So if there's one thing I want you to walk away from this presentation remembering, it's that brownfields do pose threats to our communities and waterways, but they also present opportunities to be cleaned up and transformed into community assets. And this is really important because there is, despite everything that's going on, there is funding available for brownfields reuse that can be integrated into a watershed management program for resiliency. Before I jump in and tell you what the definition of brownfields is, let's rewind a little bit, go back in time to the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s during the Industrial Revolution. So this is a period of American history where our cities and small towns, especially New Jersey, contributed to our industrial productivity. This is when we started to really get efficient with our manufacturing process. We built factories, mills. We started to use petroleum and other chemicals in our manufacturing process, and we use them in large amounts. A lot of these factories were located along our waterways to take advantage of the hydropower and the transportation that they offered. Also at this time, we weren't just using chemicals and petroleum, but we were also, producing a lot of industrial waste at this time. And back then, remember, we're talking about 17, 18, early 1900s. What did you do with industrial waste? You just dumped it out the back door, or you dumped it into the nearby river, you buried it in a pit somewhere. And this continued for, hundreds of years until our first environmental laws, which wasn't until like the 1960s. At that time, then there was also an economic shift, which prompted a lot of these factories to close, move to other states, maybe move overseas, maybe became obsolete, and they left a lot of that mess behind. So that's the background of brownfield. So the definition of brownfield is a real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. That's the EPA definition. New Jersey, our definition is pretty similar. We say it's any former or current commercial or industrial site that is currently vacant or underutilized and on which there has been or there's suspected to have been a discharge of a contaminant. So that's New Jersey's definition. So those big factories might be what comes to mind, like a big abandoned factory when you think of brownfield. But that's not necessarily the only site. A lot of smaller commercial sites also use chemicals. Here we're thinking about dry cleaners, gas stations, even buildings, just by nature of the building materials themselves, like asbestos or lead paint, those can be considered brownfields as well. Not all brownfields are contaminated, and not all contaminated sites are brownfields. So if you have a gas station, it's in business, but it's experiencing a leaky underground tank, that's not a brownfield because it's not vacant or underutilized. But again, it doesn't necessarily need to have confirmed contamination because it's just more about the perception that it's contaminated based on its prior use. So I'll go through a couple examples of that with you. I know that can be a little confusing, but the designation, it's not official. You don't need a certificate from the DEP saying this is an official brownfield. It's not determined by the size. They can be in rural areas, urban areas, and there's just a lot. There's a ton, especially in New Jersey because of our industrial past here. Of course, there's negative impacts of brownfields. They can contribute to deterioration, negative perceptions of neighborhoods. They can attract vandals, unwanted illegal activity, continue to degrade the environment, not just by the contamination that's there, but they can be kind of a popular dumping ground. They can impact property values, and we now know they're not just eyesores. They really can impact the way people feel about where they live and their community. So, believe it or not, though, there are some advantages of having brownfields in your community. I mentioned a lot of them are located along waterways, rail lines, central roadways. A lot of them do have really good locations. Maybe they're in a downtown area, making them advantageous for redevelopment or conservation projects, as we'll discuss later. Many already have existing infrastructure like utilities, sewer lines. These are very expensive to put in a greenfield development, we say. They can also just be really cool old buildings, have historical and architectural significance. But most of all, the number one advantage of having a brownfield in your community is the potential that it holds to be transformed into community assets. So we're also looking at this from a triple bottom line. Okay. When we address brownfields in our communities, we're improving the environmental quality because, first of all, we are removing contamination. Then we also have the opportunity to improve the environment by dealing with flooding, opportunity to incorporate some sort of green infrastructure, that sort of. We can improve the community's economic conditions by catalyzing economic development, creating jobs, increasing tax revenue for a town, and diversifying the local economic base. And remember when I said these are more than just eyesores, right? So addressing them where removing this health and safety hazard, improving community appearances, and alleviating community fears and worries about what's going on with that site. And we're transforming them into community needed uses. So yeah, we love to say cleanup and redevelopment of brownfields are key ingredients to creating economically, environmentally, and socially equitable communities. So there's no set recipe on how this happens. There is a generalized process. Here are the different stages of brownfield redevelopment. Um, and again, this isn't always linear. Sometimes you'll take one step forward, have to go back a step, but that's just all part of the fun of the project. So the most foundational stage is planning. Like most challenges, you really need to understand the scope of the problem at hand before you can address it. We're in New Jersey, so then you're going to hire a licensed site remediation professional to walk you through assessing the site, determining if contamination is there, and cleaning it up before reusing the site for redevelopment. And once you're on this journey, there are things that need to happen at the beginning and then all throughout to nurture your project. These are meaningful community engagement, finding funding sources, finding more funding sources, building and keeping partnerships, and having a site reuse vision and being flexible and willing to adapt as the project goes on and as you learn more about your site. So I'm going to talk about each of these stages. First, planning. This is, I would say, the most important, really the foundational stage of your brownfield process. This is because when it comes to brownfields, it can be very easy to just have tunnel vision, keep a site-centric perspective, but it's important to keep a community perspective and have a strategic approach and a cohesive plan for the community. This will help you get funding. It'll help you overcome project hurdles and ensure continuity, if there's administration or leadership changes locally. You're going to build a brownfields task force. You're going to have think of this as a bus. The brownfield champion is the person who's driving the bus. Then you have your partners and stakeholders that will keep the project's momentum moving forward. These are people with the capacity, the resources, as well as a stake in the game to, again, keep the project moving forward. The first step in your journey is the brownfields inventory. This is really where you're identifying brownfields in your geographic area, getting a handle on the scope of the issue. You might find there's a concentration of brownfields in a certain area that might emerge as a target or a priority area. And then you're going to prioritize those sites based on criteria you choose. So for your organization, everyone on this call, maybe we're prioritizing areas of flood zone, areas where we can create some meaningful habitat. So let me show you more how this process would actually play out. So again, we've created a map here showing the headwaters region. Each of these dots are sites that have been or currently are in New Jersey's site remediation program. I also have the definition of brownfields up here because I don't want you to think like all of these are brownfields. No, or you need to think about the definition, but really, whenever I'm putting together a brownfield inventory, this is where I start. This database is a really good resource. So you map these out, and then you use your local knowledge or field verification to know if the site is vacant or underutilized, and if you put it on your brownfield inventory. So let's look at a couple examples. All right. Let's see, put it in the chat. Is this a brownfield? Would you put this on your inventory? NJDEP is telling us that it is in the site remediation program. So check that box. Now we're just looking to see if this site is vacant or underutilized. If you have any thoughts, feel free to put in the chat. No pressure. I don't want to put you on the spot here. Yes, I would say looks vacant, not really sure. The grass is overgrown. This is a Google Street View map, so you have to pay attention to what year it is. It might take some field verification. And And it's okay to say, maybe we need some more information. We need to check other sources. That was an old picture of the site. Let me show you a newer picture. And I gotta say, I've actually never seen this. So this site actually has been redeveloped. This is a residence and it's for sale. Um, I just noticed actually you could see the drums here. They're probably still doing some monitoring and sampling, making sure it's safe for somebody to live here. I think there's an office space. It kind of reminds me of, when a dentist might have their office in their house. But in the listing, they also have this historic photo. And if you know what to look for, you know that these are gas pumps here. So this was a gas station at one time. It's technically, I guess, as far as I know, still vacant because it's for sale. It's already been redeveloped. So this is a gray area. I might put it on my inventory just to kind of keep track of it. I really like this example though. Again, I don't know if I've ever seen that before, but here's another one. Is this site a brownfield? So this is a gas station currently undergoing remediation. I This looks like it's still a very active business. So I would not put this on my brownfield inventory. They are experiencing some kind of contamination, but it's still an active business. So oh, this one. This property is vacant. Um, in previous pictures, you could tell it's just an open field. There were some structures there. This purple outline is showing that there's a known groundwater plume. So we definitely know this is contaminated. These blue things sticking up in this picture, those are monitoring wells. So, someone's out here sampling the site. Um, is Yeah, this is the Myers property, Kingtown. Um, this is kind of a trick question because this is a Superfund site. So for the most part, Superfund sites are a different category than brownfield. This is because Superfund sites, especially on the national priorities list, the federal government has come in, they're coordinating and paying for the cleanup. So a Superfund site isn't going to be eligible for the same funding sources that brownfields are that we're going to talk about later in this presentation. Um, they can sometimes be considered brownfields, sometimes not. So there's kind of a gray area there. So it's not always straightforward. I also found this site as I was just poking around those dots on that map. On the DEP's website, if you click on those dots, sometimes they will have electronic reports that then you can access and look through. So here's a site. You can see there's a New Jersey Transit train. I think maybe at some point this was used as a train station, but it was also some kind of textile factory. And this is another thing I actually like. I haven't seen this before in reviewing reports, but you see they have an oil tank here, and I think this is an EPA document, someone noted that this is just bad stuff in here. And it's right along Chambers. It's noted as Chambers Creek Stream here, but I think it's Chambers Brook is the actual name of it. Yeah, so you can dig up all sorts of things. Sometimes, it's not always immediately obvious looking at a site, determining is it a brownfield or not. So that's where NJIT can help you. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's revisit. Okay, so now we've done our brownfield inventory. Um, Now we're going to pick our priority site. And this can be based on a couple things. It can be based on your site reuse vision, maybe, something to advance the mission of your organization or engaging the community, seeing what they're wants and needs are, and what else is going on in the community. What does the town master plan say? Is there flooding? Is that an issue in the community? And you take into account all those different aspects in an integrated way, they might and still inform this process. Once you select a priority site, then you develop a blueprint. So this is your site-specific plan about how you're going to identify site conditions, data gaps, how you're going to address them, and what the next steps are. We have our priority site. Now we're going to assess it. We're going to do a site assessment, determine if it's possibly contaminated, if so, where, collect samples. If it is, then we're going to make a plan to remediate it. I did mention, so we're in New Jersey. This is a process that a licensed site remediation professional will, you need to hire one, and they'll guide you through the process. First, we're going to do a phase 1 environmental site assessment and a preliminary assessment. That's the first step. Why do I say both? So a preliminary assessment is something that gives you liability protection. In New Jersey, a phase 1 environmental site assessment gives you more like federal protection. They're pretty similar. There are some big differences between those two documents. An LSRP will be able to do a combined one for you. That's my recommendation, because you want to do a baseline assessment before you acquire a property. So that's whether you're a town, nonprofit, a private developer. That's my recommendation. Do this before you take title to the property. Then, after you identify if there's potentially contaminated areas on your site, you're going to collect samples, soil samples, maybe some groundwater samples. This is during the site investigation phase. If you do determine it is contaminated, you need to see how far that contamination spreads, how deep it goes, and then that's remedial investigation phase, and then you'll make a plan to clean it up. And your final remediation document is called Response Action Outcome. That is a very quick overview of pretty long and expensive process. Each of these red bars are some sort of report or deliverable that needs to be submitted to the DEP. Thankfully, now you don't need to wait for their approval to move on to the next one. So this process is a lot more quick than it was in the past. And that's because of the licensed site remediation professional program. So how you'll pay for all that, we'll talk about in a little bit. But first, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Carrie. She's going to talk about redeveloping brownfields for water quality and resilience.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Caitlin. Caitlin's provided us a great overview of the brownfield redevelopment process. I wanted to add to what Caitlin's already discussed by going into a bit more detail about potential brownfield pollutants, their potential impacts, and what could happen if those pollutants entered stormwater. Next slide, please. So this table is reproduced from the EPA's fact sheet on environmental contaminants often found at brownfield sites. Legacy pollutants, like many listed in this table, were used in a variety of past land uses from the beginning of industrialization to like the mid-20th century, as Caitlin had mentioned. These legacy pollutants can remain in the environment long after they're introduced. These materials weren't recognized as harmful when they were initially being used. So people didn't know necessarily the extent of the damage that these materials can cause, and they didn't know the long-term effects of them as we do now. Let's think about some of our past land uses, things like mining, plastic production, insulation, dry cleaning. If you look around your community, you might see some of these land uses. If you look into historical documentation, as Caitlin showed us, you can also find those. Understanding your property's history can help you identify these past activities. both in the use of materials as well as their disposal practices. And knowing this information can help you anticipate what contaminants could potentially pose environmental health risks. So let's talk about two common brownfield contaminants and how they could potentially enter our environment. So we're going to talk about petroleum and volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. Next slide. And click once more. So because it's so widely used, petroleum contamination is widespread. Any site that stored fuels to power equipment or vehicles has the potential to be contaminated. Gas stations, auto repair shops, power generation facilities, mining, metalworks, ag, and manufacturing of other kinds. So any site that stored fuels for heating might also have petroleum contamination, which includes both private and public buildings. Petroleum is released to the land and into water via oil spills, and could also enter via leaks from old storage tanks. In this image, you can see one of my colleagues standing next to an excavated underground storage tank, which is also known as UST. So this storage tank held about 2,000 gallons of oil when it was underground. And if you look at its condition, you can see it has some irregular shaped holes in it. And when USTs become damaged or forgotten, they can act as sources of petroleum contamination. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. They're carbon compounds that can evaporate at room temperature. There are things called aromatic hydrocarbons, which are VOCs commonly found in petroleum products, like benzene. And also aromatic hydrocarbons can be both volatile organic compounds as well as petroleum products. Other VOCs are chlorinated solvents like trichloroethene, or TCE, which are used as industrial degreasers for dry cleaning, paint thinners, or part cleaners for machinery. Chlorinated solvents are like synthetic compounds, meaning that these chemicals you might not encounter in a natural setting. They have to be man-made. So the need for solvents in dry cleaning, auto repair, metal recycling, and other manufacturing makes VOCs a potential contaminant in these past activities. Their use for disinfecting and pest control could also mean there's potential contamination in office buildings and farmland. VOCs can then be released into the environment, again, via spills of petroleum. Chemical solvents from storage drums or during transit can also spill. And damage underground storage tanks, as I mentioned before, can also be a source of release, as well as leaking sewer pipes and stormwater runoff. Once in the ground, VOCs adhere to soil solids and remain in place, but other VOCs will dissolve into groundwater and migrate through the ground in a chemical plume in the water. VOCs also evaporate from soil and groundwater into soil vapors. Volatile vapors can rise through the ground and squeeze into buildings, which you can see a little graphic of. Kaylin, if you press. Some arrows should show up. Yeah. So volatile vapors can rise through the ground and squeeze into buildings through cracks and foundations, where they can be inhaled by the folks in those buildings, which is a process called vapor intrusion and is the primary concern with VOC contamination. Next slide. So I focused on petroleum products and VOCs because of their potential extent in common past uses. Many brownfields could have at least one or more of these contaminants, and others, as Kaylin mentioned prior. So for example, if you have an abandoned or a former gas station, rather, it can have underground storage tanks that have been abandoned and damaged that would leak petroleum products into the soil. Again, petroleum products can also contain volatile organic compounds that can migrate into and contaminate the groundwater. An old building on the site of the old gas station can also potentially have asbestos and lead piping or paint present that could affect the air quality. So environmental contamination is intricate, which is why in the state of New Jersey, we have the LSRP program in order to monitor that process. So now that we've kind of talked about what's occurred on a site and the ways that it can enter the environment, you can kind of see how by entering the air, the water, the land, contamination isn't always bound by site boundaries. Contaminants can take on dynamic lives beyond their release. They can, again, enter different media and then move in the general flow direction of that media, whether it be water flow or airflow, what have you. So brownfield sites might not even hold high levels of contamination, but it can be diffuse. So if we go to the next slide, we can see how exposure pathways work and how folks can encounter contamination potentially if you click once more, or probably a couple times more. Yeah, once more. The graphic should show up. Fantastic. Okay. So here you can see an example from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention of an exposure pathway. So it's the physical course that a contaminant takes from its receptor to a person that might be exposed. So to characterize the exposure pathway, you would have to consider the fate and transport of a contaminant, meaning how it behaves in the environment and how or if it'll come in contact with humans. So there are 5 elements of the exposure pathway. The source of contamination on the left-hand side of the screen, thanks, Kaylin, you can see some drums that spilled contaminants. Let's say it's like oil products. And then contaminant transport through the environment is the second element. There's a few illustrated here. You can see the arrow up for the release mechanism, volatilization into the air. There's also spillage into the soil and then leaching into the groundwater. The third element is a point of exposure. So you have to be exposed to a contaminant in order to be harmed by it. So the exposure point here is plumbing. And an exposure point can happen when we have wells for potable water installed in contaminated aquifers down gradient of a contaminant source. The fourth element of an exposure pathway is an exposure route, and there are different ones in this image. There's ingestion, if you are eating or drinking something, inhalation, if you breathe contaminated air. There's also dermal contact, so if you come in contact with a contaminant via skin. And that can happen if you bathe or swim in contaminated water or handled contaminated material. And then the fifth and final element of an exposure pathway is a receptor population. So that's anybody who comes in contact to it. Could be, humans or animals. And we can define and evaluate human receptors in the environment. In environmental investigations, there's usually some form of this involved in the remedial investigation phase to help determine properly protective cleanup measures. So the food chain is also listed as an exposure point here. I won't go into it to a great extent, but you can also ingest things like meat where a cow has ingested a contaminant, and then you would also, obviously like have beef for dinner. But so we have that understanding of how contaminants can mobilize in our environment. But if you go to the next slide, you can see how not only is there contamination on a site, and not only how that through the air, through the water, etc., contaminants can leave a site boundary, but they can also be further spread, and these issues of exposure can be exacerbated by extreme weather events like flooding. So unaddressed brownfield sites are also susceptible to damage by extreme weather events such as flooding. So if a above ground storage tank, which I have this image replicated again, becomes further damaged, it can further release contaminants, which could then mobilize in floodwaters and expose further folks to contamination. As an example, in 2017, Hurricane Harvey inundated a number of brownfields in Houston and potentially exposed residents to toxic pollution. Next slide. So I don't want to be hyper alarmist about this. It's important to understand, these processes. However, there are a number of ways to remediate contamination on site, as well as, in addition to that, ensure that the stormwater systems and drainage systems adjacent to brownfield sites are adequate to make sure that, number one, we're taking care of contamination on site, and number two, stormwater is redirected off-site to doubly ensure that contamination isn't mobilized even further by floodwaters. So I reproduced this graphic from the EPA with ways that we can see potential floodwaters mobilizing contamination and ways that we can do something about it. So in this image, you can see there's a potentially contaminated brownfield site, which is a closed gas station, and its adjacent roadway and the site itself are experiencing flooding. You can see that the roadway itself is a paved over surface. The site itself is a paved over surface. And the drainage systems, like a culvert, that you would imagine kind of where the number 3 would be, is not adequate in order to capture this rain event. So if we go to the next slide, you can see what we can do about this. So again, the EPA recommends, first of all, removing and reducing the number of contaminants on site. So you can imagine they put like a cap on top of this closed gas station in order to remove exposure to the soil. And then again, we want to make sure that we're redirecting the stormwater off-site so it doesn't even interact with the site itself. There are ways to not only use kind of gray traditional infrastructure, so making sure like where that 3 is, that there's culverts and things to capture that stormwater and the piping is adequate, the culverts are cleaned of any debris, but also there are some green infrastructure solutions that we can integrate, again, away from the contamination off-site. So you can see there's vegetation now in between the sidewalk and the roadway, and that can act to capture the stormwater and infiltrate it into the soil so it doesn't come in contact with the site. Next slide. This is just a summary of some stormwater management solutions. So again, you have this gray infrastructure, this traditional infrastructure, such as improving drainage systems, creating ways to store or redirect floodwaters, and protecting sewer systems and utilities from flooding. But there's also green infrastructure solutions that you can have, again, off-site, such as a stormwater park. So the bottom image that you'll see is a screenshot of the Hoboken Northwest Resiliency Park. So this is a great example of brownfield reuse. So it actually was a brownfield in the city of Hoboken, and they cleaned it up and turned it into like a 5-ish acre stormwater park. And there's a very intricate piping system underground that captures billions of gallons of stormwater and holds it in place until after the storm event, and then filters it back into the system. But surrounding the park is green infrastructure solutions to capture the storm water around the site and then hold it and redirect it into that intricate piping system. And also, you know, during blue skies when it's not flooding, the site is also just a great place to like bring your kids. There's a playground. I think there's a little coffee shop in the center as well. And this was, Kaylin will go a little bit into funding, but this was funded partially through not only the city of Hoboken, but also through FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation programs. Next slide. So obviously, in the beginning of this presentation, I talked about a number of potential contaminants that are found on brownfield sites. So obviously, I'm trying to underscore the fact that all site reuse needs to make sure that we're not mobilizing contamination. And so you want to work with your licensed site remediation professional to ensure that if you want to integrate green infrastructure solutions, that they are appropriate for your site. And some resources in addition to further familiarize yourself with potential green infrastructure solutions are the New Jersey Stormwater Best Management Practices Manual, as well as New Jersey Futures Green Infrastructure Municipal Toolkit. Next slide. So Kaylin is, not only do we have our Hoboken example, which is more urban, the Raritan Headwaters is a less urban environment, more suburban. So Kaylin's going to go into some more detail about a similar project of a brownfield site that successfully integrated green infrastructure solutions in Bloomfield, New Jersey at the Lion Gate Park. And I'll kick it back over to Kaylin.
All right, great. Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, as Carrie said, now we're going to dive into another example of a former brownfield, which is now used for community resiliency. So we call this Lion Gate Park. This is what it used to look like. This is the historic map before it was a park and before it was a brownfield. It was a factory in Bloomfield at the confluence of two rivers here. It spent a couple decades as a thread company, and then it was a scientific glass factory for quite some time. I like this image here. It really shows how you have the confluence of the Third River and Spring Brook. And, you know, it's quite an extensive factory. They did have some like lagoons here and settling ponds. After a couple decades, this closed maybe in the 1980s and then sat vacant for a very long time. As you know, climate has changed. We've been experiencing more precipitation, more intense storm instances. The surrounding community has been through a lot of flooding, not just directly in this area, but also downstream as well. Downstream is where Bloomfield's main downtown center is, so a lot of businesses also experience flooding. It's just a really big problem for the community. Over time, this area all surrounding it was built up with residences that were really impacted by this constant flooding. Eventually, this site in the 90s caught a developer's attention. Despite being contaminated, they wanted to put a housing development here. However, nearby residents very much resisted this plan. They had a grassroots campaign against the development, and they had some really creative engagement techniques to remind residents of the impact of flooding and how it would get worse with this planned development. So I didn't really talk much about community involvement in your brownfield project. It is a very important aspect, and I think this is a really good example of what can happen if you as local officials, local leaders don't include the community in your redevelopment plans. If you don't have the community support, they can really slow down your project, even stop it. So if you think back to the planning stages, that's really when you want to start to get public buy-in to your project. So this grassroots campaign was eventually successful due to this local advocacy, and eventually there was political will to, stop and say, hey, it's great that people want to move to our community. We can certainly use more housing, but it was actually that plan was scrapped in favor of a park, which is inclusive of over a 4-acre restored wetland area. Now, the grassroots activists, they did have to compromise with the town on a turf soccer field. And as part of negotiations and compromises to give everyone what they want, but it kind of works out because this turf soccer field acts as a cap over some remaining contamination at the site. So they didn't have to go through the extra expense of excavating every molecule of contamination. Now they can put a cap over it, make sure that it's safe for human health and the environment. They assess those receptors, like Carrie had mentioned, and came up with that solution. They not only did they create this wetland that's designed to capture stormwater and improve the quality of it, but it's also a habitat. And they ran with this theme with this development too. They used native grasses, shrubs, and flowers to do landscaping in the other areas. They also did some stream bank restoration. Now this says unusable land. But there was some restoration efforts here, and there's a pervious parking lot as well. So of course, this project was not cheap. And in order to achieve the success that they did, they compiled what's referred to as a funding stack in order to finance this project. So you'll note here, they used funding from several different sources at the DEP, from different departments, and often agencies will design their grant and loan programs with the intent that they can be used together and stacked together. So now I'm going to discuss what some potential funding sources can be if you want to do something similar in your community. The first I'm going to start with is Hazardous Discharge Site Remediation Fund. This is HDSRF. This is a fund that it's a state fund. It's funded through an extra tax that some industrial businesses have to pay in order to fund cleanup. So this is a pretty well funded program. It's very popular. It's a grant and loan program that supports brownfield assessment and cleanup. So if you're a public entity like a local government, they will 100% cover the preliminary assessment, site investigation, and remedial investigation. You get to use your own LSRP for this. You get to use your own contractor, and they do disperse the funds up front. So it's a really good, popular program. Probably most brownfield projects have utilized this fund, although I don't think the Lion Gate one did. But anyway, and then they also do have grants available for site cleanup as well. The amount that they fund is dependent on what the site end use is going to be. So it's on the upper end, that's 75% if your site is in a designated brownfield development area. Those are usually more like the downtown urban cores. But Also 75% if your end use is recreation, conservation, renewable energy projects, 50% for affordable housing, and if you clean it up to the most stringent standard, you get 25%. There is a loan program. This usually isn't for public entities, but this is a good resource for private entities. The NJEDA also has something called the Brownfields Impact Fund. So this is something that's funded through the EPA revolving loan funds. They at one point were giving out grants as part of this project. That I understand has been exhausted, so they're just providing low interest loans now as part of this program. Another good source to be aware of is the New Jersey Water Bank. So their mission is to provide and administer low interest rate loans to qualified borrowers. So that's like the public sector, for the purpose of financing water quality projects. So you might be familiar with this, but they also, Brownfields is part of their, the categories of projects that they will finance, part of this program. So this program, you get a loan, 75% through the iBank, the other 25% is through the DEP. And it's a low interest loan program. I dug up the 2024 rate was 2.25%. So those are, there might be a bunch of other potential funding options for New Jersey. I do also want to mention the federal funding sources as well. So this is a summary of the EPA Brownfield fiscal year 2025 grants. The main thing I want to point out here is that because in the bipartisan infrastructure law, Brownfields received the Brownfields program received a pretty hefty influx of additional funding. So through a congressional law, there are regular appropriated funds. So typically these are the sort of amounts that you'd see the Brownfield program funded at. Many, many millions more were added. So the past couple years, it has been like kind of gangbusters out there. There has been a lot of money available. It's still supposed to be available this upcoming grant cycle. We'll see. Fingers crossed that's still going to be available because it is committed. So you have different grant types here. You do have assessment grants. That's different than a cleanup grant. So depending on what point you're at in your brownfield redevelopment project, is going to depend on what sort of grant you're potentially eligible for. And just to give you a quick overview of what that cycle looks like. Sorry, this is a carryover from from an older presentation. They were out in the September-October timeframe. It takes them a while to review everything. They make an announcement in the springtime, then the funds become available in the summer, and you're ready to start a couple months later. So just to give you perspective, from the time you apply for one of these grants, if you're successful, that's a year until you see the money that you can then go ahead and start your project on. So that's why, again, like planning is really important. I think the timelines for New Jersey's funding, like that HDSRF, it's more on the order of like months, not a year. But you still want to be able to take that into account in your timeline. Here's a handy little chart about funding applicability. You need to know you know, the public sector is eligible for a lot more funding than the private sector. However, the public sector can work with private developers in a partnership to get these projects complete. And in fact, that's really, I think funders like to see that because it's more of a viable project. They want to give money to projects that are actually going to go somewhere. So that's the end of our presentation. I do just want to maybe introduce our program and who we are and who you've been listening to for this past hour before we take some questions. But as you can see, this process can be complex. There's a lot of different aspects to it. This was just kind of like a basic. We're just scratching the surface here of what's out there. And, if it was easy, everyone would do it. So that's why we're here. We are funded through the EPA to provide free technical assistance to communities in EPA Region 2, which is New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and Virgin Islands. I do like to mention we also do this for Region 4, which is the whole southeastern states. So we do have a really good, not just local, but kind of national perspective too of like what's going on with brownfields and what's possible. We've been doing this since 2008, and there's two main things I like to highlight about our programs. One, that we are an independent resource. So even though we are funded through the EPA, if you're not interested in EPA funding or if it's not right for your site, we're not going to push you for that. We can still provide assistance to you. And the second most important aspect of our program is that it is free. There is no application process. Now, Carrie and I'll put up our contact information at the end, but you just reach out to us, whether it's a question, whether you want to meet every week, it's up to you. We really tailor our assistance. We do have a multidisciplinary team. So as I mentioned, my background's in geology. I am a licensed site remediation professional. Carrie's a planner. We have other environmental scientists, engineers on staff here. Our program consists of three main ways that we deliver our technical assistance. First is Brownfield Academy, which is our website. We've really been able to up our game here. So we have some really good how-to videos. We're now creating some learning modules. We have infographics, success stories. You can sign up for our newsletter here. All of our previously recorded webinars are up on our site. The second way we deliver technical assistance is through forums like this, educational forums. So again, thank you so much to Raritan Headwaters for inviting us here. If you think this is a message that you want your specific community to hear, let us know. This is something we can provide. And we do in-person things. We also have, I do just want to highlight one event here we call an IAWG, Interagency Working Group. This is, say you're interested, you have a project, you really want to understand how you can put together your funding stack with those different DEP sources. We can get everyone all in one room and you present your project and everyone puts heads together on how you can overcome your challenges, whether it's funding, permitting. We can facilitate that sort of session. Our main bread and butter, those are one-on-one technical assistance, and this is really, again, tailored to specific communities' needs. Every community is unique. Every brownfield is unique. So we can't have just a menu of assistance that we can provide. Here are some bullets as an example, but yeah, we'd really, just sit down, work with communities, hear the challenges and how we can assist. So here's our contact info. I see Mara has her hand raised.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. There's so much great information in this. I just applaud you both and thank you. It's complicated, and I posted something in the chat too, which I found useful. Another NJIT publication for how to kind of tackle these brownfields inventories. I guess there's no real standard methodology for these, so I thought that may be helpful to folks. I had a specific question around the current inventories, brownfield inventories in New Jersey. I think right now it's limited to municipalities in the CCI, the Community Collaborative Initiative. I don't think any of those municipalities are in our watershed. So one, I guess I'm wondering if you guys have any idea if there will be an expansion of that mapping, and then also I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it's changed, that those EPA loans are awarded to only municipalities within the CCI, the Community Collaborative Initiative. And I don't know if that's changed. So if you guys have any info on that, I'd appreciate it. But yeah, so thank you again for all of this. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I really love your question, and honestly, that's one of the most frequent ones that we hear. It's like, okay, yeah, this all sounds great. Where can I find a list of the brownfields in my community? And there isn't one. So the DEP, they do have a mapping database. They have, as you mentioned, so in the CC Community Collaborative Initiative communities, they do have a brownfield inventory there. However, it is up to local folks to create and maintain their own brownfield inventory. This is most effective because these change all the time. So businesses close every day, unfortunately, and then there's also redevelopments that happen, and it's really too much for the DEP to keep tabs of. So the best quality inventories are done by the communities where they are. And that is something that we can assist with. We have an inventory workshop that we can do to like really teach you how to put those together. I don't know if I've heard of the DEP having plans to expand, but I think they do keep it updated, those lists periodically. Oh, and then your question regarding, okay, so there was some funding available through the EDA. They are prioritizing those brownfields in those CCI communities. And for certain programs, you also get an extra percent. Trying to think. There are some incentives, right? They want to incentivize specifically brownfield redevelopment in those CCI communities. But you don't have to be in one of those communities in order to be eligible for that funding.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So Kaylin and Carrie, thank you so much for your presentation. Lot of information. I'm gonna allow Dawn to talk. She had a question earlier. Dawn, would you like to ask your question?
I'm sorry, I'm right here. Hi, this is
Hi.
I just had a question for Kaylin. Is it required to do both the preliminary assessment and the phase one, or is that just a recommendation?
So in New Jersey, it is required to do the preliminary assessment. If
Mhm.
you want to be eligible for any of that funding, you also need to do the phase one.
Okay.
So there's no real rule in New Jersey that you have to do the phase one environmental site assessment unless you want to qualify for that funding, which, you know, can be huge. So that's why I definitely recommend doing both.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else have any questions? Yeah, I had a couple. So something that keeps popping up in the news and in our watershed in particular, well, all over the world really, are PFAS pollutants and contamination. Is that something that you're seeing more of or getting more involved with, those kind of contamination sites?
We're definitely keeping an eye on it. And of course, yes, people are talking about it more. When it comes to brownfields, I am seeing more and more that's something that's being screened for. Although there was a study that just came out that showed that it's not really having a huge impact on whether or not property transactions move forward.
Okay. So I guess that can lead into the next question. So I guess we're talking about so a municipality identifies a contamination site or a potentially contaminated site, that they either own or that they're considering purchasing from the property owner. Am I correct so far?
Yeah, or foreclosing.
Or foreclosing.
Yeah.
So what kind of would the process be to make the property owner responsible to remediate the contamination versus, like the municipality?
So as the property owner, they are responsible for cleaning it up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, realistically, that can be very expensive. If they're a private entity, they might not, have the funding to do so, and they might
Yeah.
not qualify for some of these funding sources to do so.
Right.
But the municipality is eligible for that funding. So that's why,
Got
we
it.
do recommend if you can work together in partnership, that can be successful.
Okay. So that partnership sort of makes the whole cleanup more possible because the funding is easier to acquire. All right, well,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Makes sense. I don't know, I was just curious when they cap, like you were showing that one, the soccer field, I guess
Mhm.
what are they actually capping with? Do you know?
Yeah, so the main thing that you want to prevent when you're capping contamination is it mobilizing and moving elsewhere, like moving off site or moving somewhere where it can someone or something can be exposed to it. So in that particular instance, at the Lion Gate Park, they're looking at metals contamination, and metals will stay put because they
Okay.
do like to stick to the soil particles.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what they put over is a geotextile fabric. Sometimes, depending on what the engineer deems appropriate, something that's going to prevent water from infiltrating. Um, and then you can put clean soil over that. They did put a turf field there, which, has its own problems, but
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's an engineering control. It's a term for something that just,
Mhm.
cover.
Yeah, I'm just curious that if down the road there are issues with the caps, do they kind of deteriorate at some point? Do they have to be checked on every couple of
Yeah.
decades?
No, even in New Jersey, they're very serious about that. You need to check the cap every 2 years. And
Oh,
say you're gonna
wow.
do construction. So for instance, that Lion Gate site, they did eventually want to put light poles there. So that's something that requires a lot of approval through the
Mm-hmm.
LSRP and the DEP. Once the cap's in place, they don't want you disturbing it.
Got it.
Um,
Well, that makes sense. That makes sense. All right. Well, that satisfied that curiosity. Does anyone else have any questions?
I had one kind of more follow-up, and Tracy, you started this question for me, but I was
Okay.
also wondering about the authority at the municipal level to initiate those phase 1As. I know municipalities tend to be pretty risk adverse, which, is a responsible thing to do. We don't necessarily want to take on a contaminated site as a municipality and then be responsible for it. So I was curious as to, what authority municipalities have to initiate those phase 1As on a privately held property. And yeah, I think you kind of answered it, but
That is a good question,
yeah,
actually.
I'm just
Yeah.
like, how do you, like, if a private property owner doesn't want an investigation for whatever reason, they don't
Obvious
want things
reasons.
uncovered, is there any authority the municipality can kind of step in and demand something like that?
No.
And this may not be a question for you. I may have to pose this to DEP or somewhere else. But that was my one question. And then yeah, I guess the funding, if it's a partnership, if they're willing to work together, it's good to know that that's a possibility
Yeah, it is.
there.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what the particular situation is. Sometimes you have a site where you just have like a missing property owner. You can't even find the person. Maybe they're arrear on their taxes, and this is something that's going to be like more into a foreclosure sort of situation. You can and should do a phase 1 environmental site assessment before you take title to that property. All you need is access. You don't need to own it to do that investigation. There are some communities, I don't know offhand any New Jersey that do this, although it's certainly, I believe, allowed through the municipal land use law, but you can have incentives to not keep a property vacant. So you can have a fine essentially written into your municipal tax or your municipal code that says, you need to register a property that's going to be vacant. And, that's something maybe a local fire department already does. They do need to keep tabs on that sort of thing for safety, or your local police department. You might need to register that property and pay fee every year that site is vacant. And some communities have kind of a graduated fee schedule. So the longer it sits vacant, the more expensive your yearly fee is, to try and kind of incentivize, like, hey, if you're not going to do anything with this property, let's, get off the pod here. So that is one technique.
I unmuted you, Dawn, if you want to share
Yeah,
your
I had a
experience.
similar situation where there was a big grocery store in Orange that was perceived to be a contaminated site, and it was part of the city's redevelopment area. And the owner of the store, Bravo, refused to do a phase 1 because he didn't want to be held liable for the findings or the cleanup. And somehow through the BDA and some negotiate, because he would not do the phase 1, they worked out something that they would assist with the cleanup efforts. And I'm not quite sure, but the municipality, and maybe through BDA in their environment, they were able to work out something after many years of saying, no, build around me, I don't care, because you couldn't force him. His store was active, so they couldn't force him. They were able to come to some negotiation where he would be leaving. So, and he's not going to be held liable for the cleanup. I don't have a clue, and I can find out if that's necessary and share it with Kaylin, but I do know that there's ways they can work around it.
Thank you. Okay. If anyone else has any questions? Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Kaylin. That was fabulous.
Yeah,
So
I
just
did.
go
Oh, sorry,
ahead.
before
Go
we
ahead,
wrap,
Karen.
I did want to mention, I put a couple things in the chat,
Thank you.
some links that might be useful for folks. So we've alluded to the BDA, the Brownfields Development Area Program through NJDEP. I put a link to that in the chat.
Great.
And then epa.gov/brownfields, where you can learn more about the resources through the EPA, as well as our website, which is njit.edu/tab. We also have previous webinars that we've conducted that are recorded and presentations, as well as some infographics that you all can review on your own time and ask questions about if you have them.
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to take a look at their site. It's a wealth of information. Carrie, if you don't mind, just maybe emailing me those other links that you put up there from the DEP and
Sure
the
thing.
EP. I'll share those with
Mhm.
all my communities. So this will be posted on our website, hopefully by the end of next week, and then we will put it up on our YouTube channel as well. And I'm happy to share any of the slides with anyone, or if you personally want me to send you the recording, I can do that as well. So with that, I thank you so much. And I hope people reach out to you to get some help. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Go eat lunch.
Thank you.
Hey, no, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rurt and Headwaters.
Thank you. Thank you, NGIT tab.